Good evening. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. It's tape number 415A, and it's November the 16th, 1979, side one of the tape. Based upon all the frantic calls and letters I've gotten this past week, you want me to talk about the Shah of Iran and the taking of the hostages in the embassy over in Tehran. So I guess that's what we'll get into, this subject, part of the tape at least, maybe a third, maybe a half. And I'll give you my opinion for what it's worth based upon studying history, American history and international affairs, and the way that power is taken and pushed around. I'll give you my educated guess as to what is happening. First of all, the overall view has to be taken, and it's much larger than the individual characters such as Khomeini or the Shah. I believe that this government has been set on a course of World War III ever since World War II was over. That is the very first statement I want to make loud and clear, and I've done it on many, many tapes over again. The minute World War I was over, we were arming for World War II against Russia, and the minute World War II was over, or while it was still going on, the United States and the Western nations were getting ready for World War III. That is a cold, hard fact that can be substantiated. The members of the Defense Department, the multinationals, have never wanted to deal with the Soviet Union or socialism. In order to have a country or countries that take care of their own people in terms of housing, education, medical care, old age, and so forth, you have to reduce the profits of those people that have control of the country. Therefore, any form of social change is out, and the people who control the multinationals or the huge corporations are tightening their power and tightening the vice against us and reducing the people of the world to be dependent upon them, and also getting ready for slave labor and kamikaze troops. And the overriding overview is that unless we stop World War III and say we've had enough, which people don't seem to have the energy to get into or even to try to stop, the manipulation of little people down at the lower level is very small and minute. Now, as far as the Iranians taking the embassy, they knew in advance that the United States government was planning to bring the Shah here. There was an article in the Los Angeles Times, "Captured Report Warns of Crisis," that the embassy knew that there was a correspondence going on since August the 2nd, that they shouldn't make any move until they had more control over their embassy there and more guards, and that there was the danger of hostages. This was going back, this correspondence, to August the 2nd of this year, and the hostages weren't taken until November. So all this time they knew that the embassy was subject to being taken, and that there would be anti-American reaction in bringing the Shah to the United States. And these memos said that it was inevitable that he come to the United States. First, the Shah had gone to Egypt, Morocco, Bahamas, and Mexico, but his goal was being in the United States government, and they knew that there would be protests in Iran if he had sanction here, because of the CIA putting their government under suppression for so many years. So that the move that was made with the full knowledge that the men at the embassy, or women, if there were some there were a few, would be taken prisoners, and there was no provision made. As a matter of fact, the Marine Guards literally just welcomed them in, and this was the international scene that was taken. The United States brought the Shah here knowing that this was going to happen. Now, the choices for the Iranians are limited. The choice for the United States, their action is limited, and I like to see it. I like to see a head-on collision where the confrontation isn't one-sided, and the outcome isn't what the National Security Council or the Defense Department planned, maybe. What they planned may not be what they're getting. You know, there's a play by Albee called Tiny Alice. There's a line in there, "Be careful what you ask because you may just get it." And I don't think the Defense Department, as they make their manipulations of people on their drawing boards, really understand the way the world is going to move against the United States or what they're thinking about us today. Now, the choice for the Iranians, once they took the members of the embassy there as hostage are limited. If they release the hostages, it makes them look incompetent. They wouldn't have the Shah brought for trial. They wouldn't get the money that he drained out of the country. And if they back down, it would be very bad for other countries around the world that are watching them. They have U.S. imperialism held at the throat, and if they back down, that means that the United States can go hog wild, which it has done up to this point, just as Hitler went into Poland in 1939, and then he could zigzag all over Europe and take all of the countries in Europe except the Soviet Union, and go on down to Middle East and South Africa and have a large campaign unchecked. The Iranians are holding the line, and if they back down, it would be bad for the United States because of our aggression everywhere. I think it would be bad if they changed their minds and made a deal to release these hostages at this time. If they hold them in the embassy, and incidentally there is enough food supply for 5 years, you may or may not have read that, but the embassy had a commissary there with a stockpile of food for 5 years, so they're not in any trouble, and very luxurious food. They don't drink alcohol over there, but it's well stocked with that too. If they hold them at a standstill, they get world attention at the Central Intelligence Agency, at Henry Kissinger and David Rockefeller. I don't think those people expected to be singled out in such a mass outburst on radio stations and in the press around the world. Richard Nixon, the CIA, Jimmy Carter, David Rockefeller, the Trilateralists, the Bilderbergers are all being pointed at in one way or another as the people who engineered this and brought him to the United States, and that is true. So they're getting world attention to really the sore spot of United States foreign policy since World War II was over. Richard Nixon was vice president under Eisenhower, bring Nazis to this country, and he worked closely with hard Nazi war criminals, and of course the Nixon, Rockefeller, Kissinger, Brzezinski, Carter gang is a continuation of pillaging the world, and they are calling attention to that. The second point is that they may be able to get the Shah to trial, and they may not, but they have at least illustrated that there are war criminals since Nuremberg, and that they don't have any intention to sit back and let him just get out, that they will call attention. And another point is that they may get back some of the money he took from them. Now, there's a lot of repercussions of what's going on. The third world is watching carefully, and watching, as I say, the United States, multinationals unable to move, with the will of the people coming out, even the Air Force coming out behind Ayatollah Khomeini, so that the third world is getting a sample of the fact that there is resistance against the United States, the CIA, the Rockefeller, Brzezinski, Kissinger clique, the Carter-Nixon clique. The other point is that the strong point that Khomeini has is blackmail. He holds a list of members of Congress that have been paid off with women and drugs and money, and I think this is one reason why Jimmy Carter and others can move, because even though those charges or investigations were hushed up, it was supposed to be like another Koreagate, Mr. Khomeini backed down on carrying these charges through against the United States, and I felt that that was his barter for being allowed to survive after the Shah was kicked out. Just last week, the House Ethics Committee decided to dismiss all allegations that members of Congress got payoffs for gifts and for narcotics and sexual favors from the Shah of Iran, and no charges were brought against the rulers. And this was, as I say, a barter, a blackmail barter that Khomeini holds over them. And if they get too difficult, he can let out the list of the various congressmen that have been paid off by the Shah and who they are and the role that they played and what they received in favors of women and so forth. And that's why Jimmy Carter sits so quietly. Another reason why they're sitting so quietly and can't move. There are a lot of people screaming on the radio talk shows and articles, retaliate, fight back. But information is power. I've said that many times. Blackmail is power. So Khomeini has the eyes of the third world watching us and watching America respond, holding a war criminal here and responding, and also he holds the blackmail. Another trump card he holds is his economic hold. He asked this week to withdraw billions of dollars from Chase Manhattan Bank, from David Rockefeller's bank. I often said that the Arab countries would never blackmail the United States. There's a book, The Crash of '79, on how if they withdrew their money from the banks here, this country would collapse. And I said, no, they would just call an emergency order and tie up the money and not release it to them. Well, that's what's happening right now. The President of the United States has used his emergency orders to say to Mr. Khomeini, you can't take the money out. But that also tells other investors overseas who have money in American banks that once they put it in, if they want to pull it out at a time of crisis, it's ours. Once we just take it. They forget how the West was won and who they're playing with. They're playing with a bunch of John Waynes out here. And so that it becomes very obvious to the rest of the world that their investment is not going to be released from the bank just because they want it, and that was proven this week. And then they have documents. This is their fourth strong point, Khomeini. They do have correspondence and documents that they were planning to move the Shah here, that he wasn't sick. They keep asking for him. They want to send a medical team to see him. We don't know whether he's in that hospital or had face surgery or whether they're going to declare him dead soon of a Jack Ruby 3-week cancer, that type of thing, and then substitute a body and cremate it in 24 hours like they did Nelson Rockefeller. And the Shah could have been taken out in an ambulance to a plane at LaGuardia Airport where he has his own planes, and there's planes leaving every day, and he could be down in Brazil at Daniel Ludwig's estate or one of these marvelous islands that are run by the Germans and the British and the Central Intelligence Agency. So the people in Iran know that the sickness is a fake, that they are using his sickness, and I use a comparison of Dita Baird. Some of you remember back, it wasn't so long ago, Watergate in 1972, and Jack Anderson broke the story that the big lobbyist for ITT was involved and had on her desk a memo of ITT to give to John Mitchell, the head of the Justice Department, as Attorney General and also fundraiser for Richard Nixon's committee to re-elect the president. They were going to give $400,000 to the committee, and in exchange the Justice Department would not break up the holdings of ITT and Huntington Hartford, the insurance company. They had a monopoly that was supposed to be broken up. When this scandal broke and it altered the convention site from San Diego, they had to move the Republican convention to Miami. It was a complicated intrigue. The lobbyist Dita Baird was sent to Denver Hospital, and she was put in bed with a heart attack and tubes in her nose and very sick. I have photographs of her that were published in the media, and later it turned out that she really wasn't that sick. They whisked her away on a medical excuse, and then one of the people working for Richard Nixon said that they sent her carnations, and the vase was bugged so they could hear the conversation inside the hospital room. So the people in Iran feel that the illness is a arrangement by David Rockefeller and Kissinger and Jimmy Carter to give the Shah asylum in the United States, that Mexico was going to kick him out anyway, and they arranged this, and it's not really a sickness. If it is a minor illness at his age, it could have been taken care of anywhere in the world. They see the economic hold that the United States has over people who invest in this country and tie up their money. They're blackmailed by the women and the prostitution, the drugs, the collecting of congressmen favorable to the Shah, and also the sympathy of the masses of the entire world against the United States and the Central Intelligence Agency. Those are the strong points of Khomeini, and you can't put them down, the will of the people and the bungling and the blackmail that they hold over us. Now, there's a question, should the army, after the hostages released, invade Iran? I think that that was the intent. I think that that was on the planning board of the Defense Department. I bought this War Games. I've mentioned it before on other tapes. I paid $20 for a set of War Games. There's a store here near the military installations that sells them, and they sell this set all over the world. And it's a story of going to Moscow by 1985, and China would be armed against Moscow at the Eastern Division, with South Korea and Japan hitting from that end. And Iran and Israel were to attack from the southern belly, from that area. So I'm sure that our Pentagon intends to have control of Iran by 1985, and into the early 80s. But whether or not we could ever set a troop there or a foot there and have the will of the people, I don't know. I think that they never counted on so many people being behind Khomeini. Now, the misjudgment of the minds of people took place in Cuba when Allen Dulles planned the invasion of the Bay of Pigs. The entire team, the Pentagon, the Defense Department, the National Security Agency said, when we land on that beach, those people will be so glad to see us because they hate Fidel Castro. They will welcome the Americans, the great Americans, as if they were anxious for prostitution, organized crime, and drug collections and the control of the island the way it was running before. The people didn't want it. The people didn't want the Americans there, and the feeling of the Cubans was behind Fidel Castro. They misjudged the feelings of those people, and I think they've misjudged the feeling of Iran, and I think it's going to get more impossible as this goes on to ever be able to set foot in Iran. And I think that the Middle Eastern countries, the Muslim countries, that have been pushed aside by the United States, we've accepted them for their oil, but we don't mingle socially with Arabs. We don't teach the children in school anything about the Arab countries. People don't know the difference between the Talmud and the Quran. We're a really ignorant country. We have schools, but we don't have an education system. We have universities, but they're really prep jobs for getting into higher education like engineering or law or medicine, or a place for girls to meet women, to meet graduate students and get married. Our universities are not teaching us about the world, and we don't know what the entire Arab world would do if they saw that they could use a boycott against us, an oil boycott against us. The Muslims may just unite their strength and decide they've had enough of the United States of America. So we're playing with something very dangerous that could be used against us. So we have to stay an arm's distance and sit and hold our peace if we can. And I think the hopes of invading will be less, because as the days and weeks go on, the real ignorance of the American people is coming out, the hatred of them for the Iranian people, the misunderstanding of the students here, of what the Shah was, of how the people felt about the Shah. There's a total confusion on the part of the people in this country to be sympathetic, to understand what they're saying, to hear what they're saying, and that is going back to the people there. And I think the lines are clearly drawn as much as ever that there is a difference between this country and the Anglo-Saxon world and their lack of understanding of the Muslims or the Asians and certainly the Africans. And I think that the other people in the world, the blacks and the reds and the yellows, are going to watch the United States, and it may be a turning point because of our disregard of how they feel as Muslims and making fun of what they wear or how they pray or what they do. I think we'll pay the price for our ignorance, and I don't think we estimated how much our ignorance would come out at a time like this. There was a long article in the San Jose Mercury this week. Shah's dream of modern Iran lies in ruins, and it tells of the widespread corruption under the Shah's regime, the concentration of power in the hands of a few, the wealth in the hands of a very few, and to the detriment of the rural poor, the gaudiness of the regime, which contrasted to the poverty in the area, the notorious Savak, the secret police, and the way the people had to give in to them and were fearful for their lives and members of their family, the way he shot down the students and ignored the attention they wanted and consideration for their right to raise themselves and get a piece of that pie, the suppression of the Savak and other political fronts, the National Front Party and so forth, were pushed aside. And Mossadegh and the Shah just took over completely. And his harassment of spiritual leaders, his disregard for the Ayatollahs and so forth. This newspaper article goes into the problems that the Shah had, and in spite of all that he was doing, the United States sent the President of the United States over there. We had Jimmy Carter and his wife dancing the January before the Shah fell. They spent New Year's Eve with them in this gaudy, sadistic environment, giving him some prestige, while the people actually were seething underneath. This article describes the Shah as the darling of the international set, who's now sick, throneless, and detested. It's funny, he is detested. It's amazing that people are just finding out now that he's detested. And now Andrew Young compares the Shah to the way the people feeling about him, the way that Israel did about Adolf Eichmann. Funny that all the time Andy Young was working for Jimmy Carter, he never dissuaded him from going to those parties or had much influence in stopping him from associating with the Shah. But anyway, the Shah's dreams are over, and there is no one that will ever, from his family, be able to rule Iran. The CIA will never be able to put him back again, and this is what they wanted. Now, there's one possibility here in this whole script that I want to talk to you about. Jimmy Carter was put into office by David Rockefeller and Chase Manhattan and Henry Kissinger and Brzezinski. The Rockefellers' big business is Middle East oil. They're oil people mostly, and they have tremendous interest in Middle East and always have had. Now, Jimmy Carter's power base is threatened. We're going to have an election in 1980, and Ted Kennedy has announced he will run, and there's some strong challengers, Ronald Reagan and John Connally and so forth. And I'm wondering if, knowing the embassy was going to be taken if the Shah was here, and then this team, Brzezinski, Kissinger, Rockefeller, and Carter, bringing him here anyway, is going to be an excuse to go to war in the Middle East as a framework to cancel the elections in 1980. Would Jimmy Carter give up the power of Brzezinski? You know, last week Brzezinski was asking for more control of the Pentagon and the National Security Council. He is working very closely with Prince Bernhard and the Nazis in Germany and the Polish Nazis, and they're so close to their goal. Would they really be voted out? In other words, if Ted Kennedy were president, I don't think he'd have Brzezinski as head of the National Security Council. So this whole team is just a few votes away of being kicked out. So are they cooking up a war, which is what Richard Nixon and Spiro Agnew were doing in Southeast Asia, to cancel the elections? Is there any chance that this whole manipulation right now of bringing the Shah here and letting those men be taken hostage, knowing it was going to happen, will be an excuse to go to war, and by going to war cancel the elections to keep Jimmy Carter, Brzezinski, and David Rockefeller in control of the White House? Everyone knows there's a strong conflict between Reagan and the Western Division and the David Rockefellers in the East, and if there's a chance that Reagan could win and Carter could be out, or Ted Kennedy could win and Carter would be out, are Carter's team going to cook up a war before 1980 elections to make sure that Jimmy Carter doesn't have to leave the White House and that they maintain control over the agencies in the East that they've had so far? Because after 1980 there may be a shift of power into the hands of a whole new team again, and this may be a way to cook up a confrontation in order to cancel those elections and have those emergency powers that are always there waiting for them. There's an article in the paper by David Broder, a syndicated columnist, just this last Wednesday, called End of the Road for Carter, and it talks about the competition and how bad he is, and on the energy front how he's failing, and on the foreign scene he's failing, and that there's a paralysis of American spirit, and that there's conflicts in Nicaragua and the Caribbean, and that Jimmy Carter is at the end of his road. Well, maybe he isn't at the end of the road. Maybe these people will cook up a little war to make sure that even although he looks weak, that the answer is to get that war over there, and then Carter would be in. There was another article this last week in the Washington Star by Mary McWhorry, Iranians fear replay of 1953 CIA coup. Carter warned of the dangers in admitting the Shah, and this article goes on how he was warned of the consequences if the Shah came here. The State Department told him what would happen, that Henry Kissinger now is putting down the demonstrations and the taking of the hostages, calling it lack of respect for America, where Khomeini said don't take the Shah in the United States, which is lack of respect for Iran. The article goes on that George Ball wasn't advised in the State Department that the moving of the Shah here was very secretive, and that it had to do with Kissinger and Rockefeller, who decided that he should be taken into the United States, and they didn't advise anybody in the Iranian area of the State Department of what they were doing. They were kept ignorant, and he was simply flown in here. And there's a quotation of Iranian scholar Jim Bill from the University of Texas talking about the lack of diplomatic preparations and messing things up, and that the worst fear was that they would have a coup and the CIA would try to put the Shah back on the throne. And knowing that the Shah probably couldn't get back on the throne, did they cook up this scene over there to get the sympathies with the Shah, and as an excuse, if they couldn't get a coup that they had in 1953, could they just go in and make a war like we did in Vietnam and just take over Iran and decimate it and then use the land for military bases against the Soviet Union? Carter knew the dangers. As I say, another article, it's the end of the road for Carter, so maybe he's playing it this way so that Kissinger and Rockefeller can keep their control over the decision-making in the White House. Acting Foreign Minister from Iran, Abul Hassan Sadr, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, sent an amazing letter to Mr. Waldheim, Secretary General of the United Nations. And maybe you read it or maybe you didn't, but there were some important points in there. And Mr. Waldheim wanted to go to Iran to look over the situation. And he wrote to him, Mr. Secretary General, don't come to Iran. Look at the problem in your own country, that America is the problem. America look at what's going on there. You don't have to come to Iran to go see what's going on. He said the American efforts to start up any kind of war will be opposed. The American government has created the psychological conditions for launching this war. What does the United States government need the war for? Why didn't the American government listen to our warnings in time and admit the former Shah to America? Isn't the American government guilty of falsely agitating its nation to support an international criminal? Any free and aware conscience would expect the American people to rise up and censure its government. You want to come to Iran. The problem and the solution is in America, he said to Secretary General Kurt Waldheim. The daily increasing provocations are not suitable solutions for a crisis that we didn't cause. The American government is using now the oil weapon that they despised in the past, he said, not to buy Iranian oil. And he says, do you think that the people of Muslim countries whose oil is sold to industrial countries dirt cheap may use this opportunity to show their discontent and anger by cutting general oil supplies and create a world crisis if that's what you want, he said. Then he said, from my own scientific research, I know that the sick economy of the United States and the unstable dollar has imposed a string of political, economic crises of the United States government. Does America really intend to stabilize the dollar at the cost of endangering world peace? And that gets back to what I contend, that the only way we get out of these depressions and build this country up, although we get more bankruptcy, is when we get into these wars and whip people up into the spirit of coughing up money for these weapons and employment. He said, in that case, it is your duty to come to Iran, or should you deal with the American government? Our people do not have anything to lose but their chains and their poverty. But your heavy responsibility means that you should prevent war at any cost. Now, when you're dealing with people who have nothing to lose but their slavery and their poverty, they're going to fight, and this time they really mean to fight. The letter goes on that says the Shah should be tried by a court and for the crimes that he committed. But he calls attention to the bankruptcy. You see, the United States is morally and financially bankrupt. Of course, I've known that for years. This is what I have studied, and I've, as much as I could, stayed apart from anyone that was a party to the corruption, stayed socially, psychologically, physically away from people that have given in to all of this kind of idiocy, because I knew it would be coming down, and I don't want to say, well, I went along with them to a certain point. At least my conscience is clear that I've been consistent, at least for the past 16 years when I really saw the light of how bad things were and what was coming down. I've stayed detached from these people, and I know that our country is bankrupt. And when a letter goes to the Secretary General of the United Nations, United Press story, and describes how this country is economically bankrupt, how it wants war, how it better be careful if it uses oil as a weapon, which we decried and admonished we didn't like before. When we start using that, other people will use it on us, and then we better watch out. There's a new book that's coming out about Iran that's very timely. It's written by Kermit Roosevelt, who worked for the Central Intelligence Agency, and it's called Counter-Coup, The Struggle for the Control of Iran. And he tells how British corporations, the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, and the United States oil companies overthrew Iran. The book has been censored. The CIA and the British Petroleum Company have taken away certain parts of the book. It's going to be published by McGraw-Hill, and I'm sure it's very timely, and that Kermit Roosevelt will give you a detail of the role he played. He was disguised as a priest in that particular revolution. Oh, the time is up. We'll do more on Iran. I didn't cover the whole thing on this one side, so we'll do some more on the other side because it is a very important subject, and I know all of you are interested in it. This is side 2 of tape 415, November 16, 1979, Mae Brussell and Carmel, and we're talking about Ayatollah Khomeini and the taking of the hostages in Iran. Before I get too far in the tape, I keep forgetting every week to tell people who hear this tape cassette on radio stations that you can get a printed bibliography for each tape. Every week, the subscribers that take it through the mail get a printed sheet with a source of references of articles and books that I've made reference to, that you can look up the material for yourself if you want to study it further. And those that hear it on the radio stations can't get those sheets. But if you write to me, Mae Brussell, P.O. Box 22511, Carmel, California, 93923, and tell me which broadcast, what the subject was, because each broadcast is numbered. If you hear it on the radio and you want a bibliography for that, tell me which sheet you want to accompany that particular week that you heard it, and identify it by the date or the cassette number when I give it at the beginning of the show or in the middle, and then write to me, and I'll send a self-addressed stamped envelope. I don't have time to address all of them. Send me a self-addressed stamped envelope, and I'll send you the bibliography that goes with those particular tapes, because the listeners at radio stations are not getting the advantage of the printed sheets. That's one reason I went off the air, so that I could have a newsletter that would be more personal to get these sheets out, and those of you who hear it and want more information can write to me about that. Well, we'll do some more on Khomeini because it is an interesting subject, and I didn't cover all that I wanted on the first half. One of the interesting things was that he was accusing the Central Intelligence Agency of draining his country and running the police system and abusing that country. And right away, Jimmy Carter sent 2 envoys over to meet him, thinking that would appease Khomeini and that he would free 60 American hostages. So he quickly sent over Ramsey, Clark, and William G. Miller. Well, if you did any homework at all and you knew the situation in Iran, you wouldn't want either of them over there. Ramsey Clark worked in the Justice Department. He was the Attorney General at the time that Martin Luther King was killed and Robert Kennedy was killed, and of course there was no conspiracy. He put down the conspiracies. He was born in Texas, and he was a very close friend. His father was a close friend of Lyndon Johnson. They were part of that inner circle in Texas, and those particular assassination teams, Ramsey Clark had covered up the political assassinations in this country. He had derided Jim Garrison and told lies about Clay Shaw in order to hurt Jim Garrison's arrest of Clay Shaw. He's always worked for the Central Intelligence Agency. He's disguised himself in recent years as a liberal, but he's worked for the intelligence community and the Justice Department, and there'd be absolutely no reason for this crony of Lyndon Johnson, the son of Tom Clark, Associate Justice of the Supreme Court, then he was also an Attorney General, there'd be no reason for Khomeini to speak to him at this time. Now, Ramsey Clark did go visit Khomeini when he was in exile just before the Shah left, and that was the excuse for having something in common with him now that he had visited him last January. But if you did a little bit of homework, you know that Ramsey Clark was always associated with the intelligence community. Then they sent over Mr. William G. Miller, who'd been in the Foreign Service. He'd worked for the Central Intelligence Agency, worked for the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence for Frank Church, also in the CIA to cover up the assassination of foreign leaders and the role of the United States in killing foreign leaders. And they sent this man over there as the other envoy to speak to Khomeini. William Clark, it's interesting, not only worked for the Senate Intelligence Committee, he had been stationed in Iran in the Foreign Service in 1959. He went to school at Oxford and then Harvard, worked with the Central Intelligence Agency, learned Farsi, and was in Iran during a lot of the turmoil when the Shah was at his heyday, from 1961 to 1964. He later went on to become a special assistant to Senator John Sherman Cooper, who was one of the 6 members of the Warren Commission appointed by Lyndon Johnson, a Republican from Kentucky. Then he joined the staff of Frank Church in 1975 in time to be chief of the staff for that intelligence panel that covered up the murder of the heads of states of other countries. So it's interesting that the envoy sent from the United States were so closely linked to the political assassinations and their cover-up in the United States. The heads of foreign leaders and Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy and John Kennedy, that those two people should be selected by Jimmy Carter to go over and talk to Khomeini. That really seems weird. You know, it's an interesting thing. If you've done your homework on the assassination of John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King, Patrice Lumumba, or the assassination attempts on Fidel Castro and other heads of states, once you've done your homework of who did it and who covered it up, those same names keep shuffling through like an old-tired deck of cards, as if the Justice Department and the Defense Department had 52 cards and tricks, and they shuffle these names over and over again. So you don't get new names. Whenever there's a crisis, you get old names. So you have to do, if you research, you like me, is go back to your old names and know what role they played then, and they're called, you know, Leon Jaworski's one of those tired old kind that's brought back, or Melvin Belli, or F. Lee Bailey. So if they didn't send Belli and Bailey, they sent Miller and Clark, and meanwhile they're sitting it out over in Turkey or somewhere because Ayatollah Khomeini doesn't want to see them. I wouldn't want to either. Robert Amayo was on television this last week on Good Morning America with David Hartman. He's a representative from the Public Relations Office that does the speaking for the Shah, a very bland young man who gives out no information. And when he was asked directly, when is the Shah going to leave the United States, Amayo said, well, he didn't think the problem was that the Shah was at fault, or should he implied that the story of what's going on with the hostages is all out of proportion, that the problem over there is that the people really don't like Khomeini, and so that they have nothing else to do because there's a depression going on. So they're taking it out on the Americans, and that he tried to pass off the responsibility. And actually Hartman was pretty strong with him on the questioning, and there's no sign of the Shah. We'll go into that in a minute. Mayo said there's 5 doctors who would put their reputation on the line, but you notice that you don't have the names of those 5 doctors, and I haven't seen them on television as of this date. I wish we could. I just know that Tricia Nixon and Henry Kissinger have been in that hospital, but I don't see pictures even of the Shah's wife going during the day or the doctors, and they haven't given any diagrams or interviews. So if they're putting their reputations on the line about the condition of the Shah, I don't see how they can if they're nameless and faceless. Robert Amayo was the man sent by Nelson Rockefeller down to the Shah of Iran when he was down the Bahamas, and made way for his entry into the United States, and now he's the spokesman for the Shah. The United States is protesting the Soviet Union broadcasting to Iran. The administration has protested that they're talking about the Central Intelligence Agency, and their radio from Moscow is saying that it's totally understandable and logical that the U.S. Embassy in Tehran is filled with agents of the Central Intelligence Agency, and they're encouraging Khomeini to continue holding on to the hostages. The United States doesn't think this is fair of Moscow doing that. Well, you should live out here in California and listen to KGO, 24-hour talk show, ABC, totally owned by ABC, and we have broadcasters that have been whipping up a war, asking for war for the last few days, particularly a man named Jim Eason. In fact, I called ABC in New York just this week and complained about the Wednesday broadcast or Tuesday broadcast of Eason, that he said at least 17 or 20 times declare war, and they're talking about concentration camps to put the Iranians in, and they're talking about using atomic bombs and sending in the Marines and killing all of them, and they make fun of Khomeini, they call him cockamania, and they're really whipping up a frather. And I called New York and I said, you don't have a two-way talk show, you have a propaganda media, and you're asking for a war that you don't know what you can do with, and I really resent that the moderator can't hear both sides without instigating or getting people ready for a state of war. They compare it to Pearl Harbor. They've never been so mad since Pearl Harbor, and I don't know what you're getting in the North, Midwest, East, South, but here in California it's really bad, and particularly Jim Eason and some of these moderators are way out of line in their prejudice and their hatred of the Iranians. And people have called in, well, 50 people died from drunk driving or from drugs and chemicals in Cambodia, but they really want a war in Iran, and they're cooking it up out here. I don't know what you're getting, as I say, but we're getting it here. And if the United States State Department objects to hostile broadcasts coming out of the Soviet Union, I also object to the broadcasting here. As a matter of fact, after I called New York City and really complained about what was going on. Easton came on the air the next day and said, well, I hear there's letters and broadcasts, and they can play my tapes if I want, and he was very subdued. I asked the New York offices to get the tapes of the radio shows coming out in California and check them out and realize that this is not broadcasting. These are the same voices that lauded Adolf Hitler and Mussolini and Goebbels and Goering until World War II broke out, and this is what they're doing out here, and it's not to be allowed. And as a matter of fact, I called in the morning, and by the time Easton went on the air at 1 o'clock, he mentioned that there had been a call for his tapes, and he was very subdued, and even subdued wasn't enough, but he toned down his cries for war. And these are the things you have to do. If you have radio stations in your city that are unfair, that are propaganda, call the owners of the station. Just call the president and the head of the broadcasting and let yourself be known. I know that there's not enough people responding, and they really should be out. Like Khomeini said, why aren't you people responding against your own country? And there's a lot to be done, and you can do it. I try, and I find that when I do step in, it works and it's forceful. And those pipsqueaks that are on the air only have not a 9-to-5 job, a 1-to-4, and they can be subdued. And we really all have to do a part in stopping some of this propaganda. The American government is so bungling. I mean, it would be nice to be proud of what they do, but they're so stupid. The Washington Post, November the 7th, had an article, Iran halting oil exports to the United States, the CIA reports. The CIA told senior Carter administration officials that Iran was going to stop sending its oil to the United States. They were going to cut off the oil to the United States, and there's a long article about how much they provided, 400,000 barrels a day, and they've decided they're going to cut that off, and the CIA had a report. That was Wednesday, November the 7th. So then Jimmy Carter gets on national television as a response. He's held blackmailed totally by Kissinger, Brzezinski, and Rockefeller, and he gets up there like a little limp puppet and says, he declares that he won't yield to terrorism. A big to-do this week, he's going to cut off the importation and purchase of any oil from Iran to this country. He declared on Monday that he would prohibit the U.S. purchase of any oil from Iran. Well, that Monday that he said that would follow the Wednesday report that Iran was cutting it off from the United States, and then the Los Angeles Times has an article, Iran embargoes the oil to the United States, saying it was the first to act, and they call attention to the fact that their ruling Revolutionary Council halted the sale of oil long before the president decided on the boycott, and then he uses that to act like he's getting tough. The leaders of this country cannot handle the intelligence and the response of the Iranian press, because out to Iran came the immediate response. You just get up there and put on a show. You know that we cut off the oil first, and therefore you have to say you're cutting it off from us. They're watching us, and they're equally as intelligent, and that's the thing that our head of states and State Department, Defense Department don't take into account, that blacks and yellows and reds can think just like white people, and maybe even better, and can figure things out and are catching on the tools of challenging us. And that is the interesting thing of Khomeini and that group of people, totally bankrupt and cut off, drained of their money and hurt by what the Shah did, but finding a sore point and holding us and making us unable to move and logically responding to every move that we make. I have so many articles going back to Iran and Kissinger and files for years of articles. I just pulled out one at random that it's called The Oil Price Scandal. It came out as a Jack Anderson article saying, in sheer dimensions, the Watergate scandal will take a backseat page in history to the oil scandal. This article was written in 1977, and it says, we now have evidence that Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger could have prevented the spectacular oil price increase which has dislocated the world economy and sent all prices spiraling. He said they have evidence in documents that Saudi Arabia, the world's largest oil producer, in 1974, wanted to hold down the price of oil. The Saudis could foresee the ruinous effect of high price in the Western world, and they appealed to the United States to keep the oil prices down. The Saudis, quite logically, tended to judge the U.S. intent by the Shah of Iran's attitude. They were puzzled when the Shah clamored for exorbitant oil prices. And, of course, those brought the profits to the David and Nelson Rockefeller gang. And the article says that there was pressure to bring the Shah, and he raised these oil prices. Finally, the late King Faisal took up the problem directly with Henry Kissinger in 1974. That's when Henry Kissinger went to Saudi Arabia, and several days later, King Faisal was dead, I think a day after Kissinger left, allegedly by a nephew that took acid at Berkeley, who was promptly decapitated, and then our oil prices went up, and I've mentioned this on other tapes before. This article says the king urged Henry Kissinger to take up the oil prices with the Shah, and he agreed to do it. But then Kissinger reported back to Faisal in February 1975. He tried to persuade the Shah to reduce the oil, but this wasn't true. It was a lie. The Secretary of State made no attempt, they say, to restrain the Shah. Later, the Shah himself told the Saudis that Kissinger never brought up the oil prices with him. The gist of this article in 1977 was that our world was set in turmoil, 1974-75, by the Iranians insisting the oil prices go up, Kissinger letting them go up, all manipulated by the Rockefellers, Henry Kissinger, and the Shah of Iran, that affected our economy, and we were in lines, and it started spiraling the inflation, and King Faisal was dead, and Kissinger and the Shah were pouring in some of their millions of profits at our expense. There's another interesting article. Shah buys a French nuclear capacity for the Rockefellers. This was put out by the National Labor Caucus in 1976, sent to me by one of the subscribers of the tapes going back, this is 3 years ago now, how the Shah of Iran intended to buy 20% of France's major nuclear and special steel plants, and that they were owned or controlled. They were safely in the hands of the Rockefeller-controlled firms or Rockefeller allies, such as Compagnie Générale d'Électricité, and it tells about the Rockefellers' own General Electric plans and the plans of the Shah of Iran with Rockefeller to get the nuclear capability into the Middle East, and then they could move in uranium. And the Rockefellers have been into the industry part and the financial, not only the oil, but the electricity and other aspects and nuclear weapons, along with the Shah of Iran for a long time before the Shah got out. Now, I'm sure that when he was moved out, they wanted to retrench and recoup their investment and get that Shah back. That's what they wanted. And if they can't do that, they can create a war and get control of the country through the war. Khomeini had an interesting aide, has one, this Ibrahim Yazdi, Y-A-Z-D-I. I never did a tape on him, but he's quite an interesting person because he holds two citizenships. One, he's deputy premier of Iran's revolutionary government with Ayatollah Khomeini, and he's also an American citizen living in Houston, Texas. When Khomeini was exiled in Paris, he was directing the struggle that helped get the Shah out. And then Yazdi from Houston, Texas, was working for Khomeini and living, as I say, in Houston at the same time. Interesting background. He came to the United States from Iran. He was born in Iran. He came to the United States in 1961 and went to MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Is an expert on cancer research at Baylor Hospital School of Medicine, where he worked until 1970, then worked for our Veterans Administration, full-time job as microbiologist. That's interesting. Born in Iran, goes to MIT, does cancer research at Baylor, is head working at Veterans Administration, working for the VA on a salary of $26,000 a year, and working with Khomeini, and holds a position as an American citizen and a deputy premier in Iran. That's a very interesting background, and there's an article in the LA Times about him, how he left Houston, Texas to visit his sister in Atlanta, Georgia, and I wonder what Iranian family was in Atlanta that Jimmy Carter or the Rockefeller family knew. So I'm just wondering how much finagling of Khomeini is going about so that the United States government can totally take over Iran. There was an article in the New York Times in 1979 in April that this Dr. Yazdi was being wiretapped by the CIA to see what he was doing with Ayatollah. It'd be more interesting to know how he acquired American citizenship and could be held office in the Iranian government at the same time. I think that's quite an interesting phenomenon for a 47-year-old scientist. He's not a political scientist, to be working as a deputy prime minister with Ayatollah at one time, and also to be an American citizen. I can't understand his dual citizenship or his role with Khomeini, or in Atlanta, Georgia, or Houston, Texas. This is a fascinating character, and I just wonder, this dual role that he's playing hasn't ever been really explored or exposed, and there must be some more to it than what we see right here. As the cancer expert, maybe, I don't know. At the time, I thought maybe Khomeini would be getting the cancer, and I don't doubt if the Shah has it. But this Deputy Prime Minister, Yazdi, is a fascinating person because of the various backgrounds and connections and the mystery of how he has the power and ability to be in two places at the same time with his scientific background, and where that fits in to the government of Iran, and if he's still being paid by the Veterans Administration in the United States while he works with Khomeini in Iran. Now we have to get to the medical condition of the Shah of Iran. Jimmy Breslin had an article in the New York News, Cancer as a Political Weapon. Those of you that take these tapes know that we've talked about cancer as a political weapon for a long time. It's an article about a woman whose husband went to see a patient in New York at the hospital there at New York and the Baker Pavilion on the 17th floor, and realized that the Shah of Iran was behind these glass doors there, and that Robert Armao, his public relations man, was there, and that they have a glass that they can see out. You can't see in, but they can see you. And this man was at the hospital visiting, and he heard a conversation that the patient, who was the Shah, was sick in Mexico, and the doctors thought he had malaria. Then David Rockefeller sent a doctor down to see the Shah, and he saw it differently, and he had a fever. And then Rockefeller, through Henry Kissinger, brought him to the United States, and there was talk about his gallstones, and they talked about a lymph cancer and a cancer in the neck, and there were all these various descriptions of diseases. And the question was asked by Jimmy Breslin if the condition is political matter and not medical. That is it really medical? Is this why he's here, or is he here for political reasons? And it goes on to say that David Rockefeller obviously is helping him, and they're using cancer. He said he's in there using cancer as a political weapon, and everybody in the world believes him except one man, the Ayatollah. Well, I don't believe everyone believes him, and as I say, I think it's quite a mystery that these doctors who are treating them as of this date are nameless and faceless. We don't know who they are. I'd like to know if one is Dr. Eshikoff, the one that quickly cremated Nelson Rockefeller just a year ago. But the illness wasn't mentioned in the memos when they were planning to bring the Shah to the United States in August. And then they went back and said he had cancer for 6 years when there wasn't a bit of evidence that he had. And now there's this big problem with his neck and the glands and also a gallstone. And there's nothing that he has that can't be treated elsewhere. And as Jimmy Breslin says, the title of the article is Cancer as a Political Weapon. The silence of Jimmy Carter on the whole matter is amazing. No person from the State Department goes in to see the Shah. No disinterested or objective, not disinterested, but objective medical team are in there. There's a real silence about what's going on in that hospital. So that what happens in the future, in the next couple of weeks, it's anybody's guess, but the cooking up of anti-Iranian feelings with the Shah of the United States is so geared to make people hate Iran that it leaves the door open for us to go in and invade and take over the territory as a base for the next war. And that's what I think is happening. In essence, that's what I believe is happening. If you read the papers every day, you see the inklings and suggestions of that war that's going to happen. An article this week, Holland backs NATO on the nuclear missile plan. The Netherlands has given the go-ahead to deploy nuclear weapons on Dutch soil. They're working with Great Britain, West Germany, Italy, Netherlands, and Belgium. They'll all eventually be ready to accept stationing of the new nuclear weapons. That's November the 13th, just this week. The modernization plan calls for the deployment of 108 upgraded Pershing II missiles, a range of 1,000 miles, then 464 more land-based low-flying cruise missiles with a range of 1,500 miles would be built and deployed in Britain, Belgium, Netherlands, and probably Italy. The Dutch reported they would be asked to take 60 of these. This is a 7-nation nuclear planning group. U.S. Defense Secretary Harold Brown will arrive from Washington for the Nuclear Planning Group meeting and join defense ministers from West Germany, Italy, Britain, Norway, Turkey, and the Netherlands. In the Dutch Parliament, the Socialist Party is objecting to the nuclear warheads. They want NATO to talk with the Soviet Union and see for 2 years before they start to develop these weapons if they can scale down. Another article this week, Bonn Aerospace Program. The West German government approved a research and development program of $722 million for aerospace industry covering 1979 to 1982. November the 14th this week, Jack Anderson, Secret Intelligence says that Brazil now has a nuclear device. They'll be testing it in the near future. That they have been supplied the material by West Germany. West Germany accepted a $10 billion deal to produce nuclear reactors for Brazil. Not only did Germany produce these nuclear reactors, but the German government has also assisted Argentina to make weapons, and they will have nuclear weapons. Argentina will have them, and they will test them above the ground and not underground, so we will have the proliferation of nuclear weapons. And also Argentina is making a deal to compete not only with Brazil with nuclear weapons, but Chile's military government is pushing for nuclear development. So you can have atomic bombs in Brazil, Argentina, and Chile that are developed by Germany, West Germany, and the United States, and Brazil is ready to test theirs right now. Another article this week, the Army wants new nerve gas weapons. The Army is asking Jimmy Carter to produce 19.3 million requests for new nerve gas for 1981 to begin the construction of a facility that will cost $170 million that would produce artillery shells filled with chemicals with nerve gas. They said that the old nerve gas isn't good anymore. It's been stockpiled too long, and they need new nerve gas. So that the Secretary of Defense has been asked for this $19.3 million for the nerve gas and $170 million facility to house nerve gas, and they would put it into shells, and I guess this would go into those weapons that are being built in the 7 countries that I named over in Western Europe. Can you really believe that people in Europe are allowing their governments to put these weapons on there for a third time around? There was a television show this week, All Quiet on the Western Front. I wasn't in Europe during the war. The United States hasn't had a war on their soil in my lifetime. And I was taken to Verdun when I was 9 years old or 11 years old. I can't remember. First time I went to Europe. And I was a very impressionable child. I mean, I just really couldn't believe all the graves and the little white crosses and the trenches. And we went through there and the stories. And I guess I've always been anti-war since that, but that doesn't affect everybody. You know, it's very broadening to travel and to see poverty in countries, and Shanghai and Tokyo, this was 1936, before the war, and Hong Kong and Egypt, and go to these trenches, but not everybody learns from it. I just cannot believe that those countries are arming again for another war against the Soviet Union. It is impossible for my comprehension, to accept the fact that they're asking for this money for nerve gas and for the deployment of these weapons, and that they really do want another war. It's beyond anything I can imagine, except that I know that it's happening. And the United States Senate this week voted $135 million to construct their space shuttle launching for their MX mobile missiles. $3.9 billion program for construction of military sites throughout the world. 300 military sites throughout the world at a budget of $3.9 billion in 1979-1980. The Senate voted again this week $30.5 million to relocate American military personnel that were down in Panama. They voted for $57 million to build roads and facilities at Vandenberg Air Force Base in California to prepare test firing of the MX missile in 1983. The Space Shuttle program just got $78.2 million for projects at Vandenberg and Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas. There's no more time on this tape to give you the allocations of some more millions for the military budget, but I think you get the idea. I'll be back with you next week. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. Take care of yourselves, and Until then, keep happy if you can. Okay?